when 28-year-old wildlife photographer Jenna Monroe stumbled upon a bleeding bobcat cub on a desolate Arizona trail. She had no idea what she was about to set in motion. Nursing the wild animal back to health in her Sedona backyard seemed like an act of kindness, until strange things began to happen. Unusual paw prints, missing objects, and eerie howls in the night soon turned her peaceful life into a viral sensation. But what the cameras finally captured one moonlit night left scientists speechless and the world shaken. This isn't just a story about rescue. It's a story about nature's untold secrets, desert discovery, Jenna, and the Arizona landscape. The Arizona desert at sunrise looked like a painting set on fire. Red sandstone cliffs glowing, the air dry and still, as if holding its breath. Jenna Monroe adjusted the strap of her camera bag and stepped over a jagged stone near the trailhead outside Oak Creek Canyon. At 28, she knew these landscapes better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. Her job demanded it. But for Jenna, it was never just a job. It was devotion. She was tall and wiry, with olive-toned skin and sharp green eyes that seemed to always be searching for the next story nature was whispering. Her black hair was pulled back into a loose bun under a sun-bleached ball cap. She wore hiking boots worn from thousands of miles, and a canvas jacket patched at the elbows. Jenna didn't care for appearances. What mattered was focus, instinct, and being invisible in the world she tried to capture through her lens. As a wildlife photographer for Sierra Nature Conservancy, she had trekked through rainforests, glaciers, and deserts. But something about Arizona had kept pulling her back. It was quiet here, honest. She liked that. That morning, something felt off. The usual chatter of birds was missing. The air was charged, like static before a storm. Jenna paused on the trail and crouched, inspecting the dust. Bobcat tracks, fresh, small, juvenile. But one of the prints was slightly smeared, the spacing uneven. A limp? She rose, slowly, keeping her steps light. Her camera swung gently at her hip. About 10 minutes into the trail, the silence broke. A sharp rustle in the brush ahead. Jenna stopped cold. There, barely visible under a patch of cactus, lay a small bobcat cub. No older than 4 or 5 months. Its tawny coat was caked with dirt, and dried blood streaked its flank. One hind leg was badly injured. The cub's ears were flat, its sides heaving. Jenna didn't move closer. She knew better. She dropped to a squat and whispered, "Easy, little one. It's okay." The cub looked at her, unmoving, not aggressive, just tired. And in that fragile, breathless moment, something unexplainable passed between them. Jenna didn't know it yet, but her life had just changed, forever. Meeting Patch, the wounded bobcat. Jenna stayed perfectly still. The cub made no move to flee. It just stared, its golden eyes wide but dull with exhaustion. Its breathing was shallow and fast. Every few seconds, its body trembled, part cold, part fear. Jenna slowly unclipped her backpack, careful not to startle it. She opened a side pocket and pulled out a protein bar, honey, and oats. She unwrapped it noiselessly and broke off a small piece, placing it on a flat rock about 6 feet from where she knelt. The cub's nose twitched. It shifted slightly, trying to raise its head. "Come on, you're stronger than you think," Jenna murmured softly, her voice like a lullaby in the silence of the desert. "Just a little bite." It took a full minute, but the cub finally dragged itself forward, paw by paw. It reached the rock, sniffed the offering, and chewed slowly. Its movements were labored. Up close, the wound was clearer now, a gash down the left hind leg, deep but not yet infected. There were small cuts on its chest and flank, like it had tumbled down a rocky slope. When it finished eating, it looked up at Jenna again. This time, its gaze held something different, uncertainty giving way to cautious trust. Jenna inched closer and set her backpack down beside her. She pulled out a flannel shirt and laid it on the ground, spreading it gently. The cub didn't retreat. It simply watched. "I'm gonna take you somewhere safe," she whispered. She moved slowly, slipping the shirt underneath its belly, careful not to touch the wound. It flinched once, but didn't resist. With slow, deliberate motions, Jenna lifted the small body into her backpack, leaving the top unzipped so it could breathe and look out. The cub didn't make a sound. It curled in, head resting against her camera pouch. On the hike back, Jenna didn't speak. Her heart pounded. This was risky. Wild animals weren't pets, and bobcats were no exception. But something told her this was different. By the time she reached her truck, the sun was high over Sedona's red rocks. She turned to look in the bag. 2 amber eyes blinked back at her. "All right, little guy," she said quietly. "Let's get you home." The backyard mystery. Patch begins to heal. Back at her cottage on the outskirts of Sedona, Jenna transformed her detached studio shed into a makeshift wildlife sanctuary. The space was small, just a 10 by 12-foot wooden room with a high window and a lockable screen door. But it was clean, quiet, and warm. It had once housed her editing equipment. Now it would house something far more delicate. The cub, whom she began calling Patch, because of the raw, fur-missing spot on his side, was still skittish but no longer in shock. Jenna laid down thick blankets and a small, shallow water bowl, then placed a heating pad under one corner of the floor to keep the temperature stable. Patch hobbled to the softest corner and collapsed. For the next few days, Jenna stuck to a strict routine. Approach slowly, speak softly, offer food, scrambled eggs, bits of cooked chicken, and later, high-protein kitten formula. She used gloves when handling anything near him, more for Patch's comfort than her safety. On the 3rd morning, something shifted. Patch raised his head when she opened the door. He didn't growl. He didn't flinch. He just blinked, slow and steady. "I see you," Jenna whispered, kneeling down and staying several feet away. "You're still in there." She'd tended to injured birds and rabbits before, but this felt different. Bobcats didn't usually tolerate captivity, even temporary. But Patch was allowing it. Not happily, not easily, but with something that resembled resilience. Or perhaps instinctual trust. Jenna began documenting his progress with short video clips. She filmed his first steps without a limp, his first bite of solid food, even the moment he pawed curiously at the reflection in a steel bowl. She didn't post much at first, just a single clip on her personal Instagram with the caption, "He's not a pet, he's a survivor, and he deserves a chance." The post received modest engagement, mostly friends and a few fellow conservationists offering advice or concern. But it was one night just before sleep when Jenna noticed something odd. She heard a soft thud near the shed's outer wall, then another. She went to the window, peered out into the moonlit backyard, but saw nothing. Still, something about the air had changed. Jenna brushed it off, thinking it might have been a raccoon or a javelina passing through. But she made a mental note to check in the morning, just in case. Tracks that shouldn't be there. The next morning, Jenna stepped into the crisp desert air, with a mug of coffee in one hand and her camera in the other. The golden light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across her gravel path. The shed was quiet. Patch still curled up on his blanket inside, eyes barely open. She walked the perimeter out of habit, checking the gate and fence line. That's when she saw them. Tracks. Fresh ones. Larger than Patch's. Not dog tracks. These were unmistakable. Broad pads. Retractable claws. A wild cat, full grown. They led along the outer fence and stopped at the screen door of the shed. Jenna crouched beside the prints. The dirt was still soft beneath them, undisturbed by the wind. The animal had been here only hours ago, watching. Her pulse quickened. Was it a territorial male? A predator sensing weakness? Or could it be Patch's mother? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She reviewed footage from her exterior motion camera, but found nothing. Frustrated, but determined, she ordered a new set of high-resolution wildlife cameras and set them up facing the shed from multiple angles. Infrared, night vision, the works. That night, she barely slept. At 2:14 a.m., the alert buzzed on her phone. She opened the camera feed, heart pounding. There it was, a full-grown bobcat, maybe 30 pounds, sleek and silver gray with faint, black markings along its spine and tail. Its body moved silently through the frame, muscular and fluid. It stopped just outside the fence, ears forward, eyes locked on the shed. Then it did something Jenna didn't expect. It sat, perfectly still, watching. And then it chirped, a soft, high-pitched vocalization that bobcats use to call their young. Inside the shed, Patch stirred. He rose to his feet for the first time without limping, padded slowly to the door, and pressed his nose to the screen. Jenna watched in stunned silence as the adult bobcat chirped again and then turned, vanishing into the dark. Patch didn't howl or scratch. He just waited, staring at the door long after the figure disappeared. Jenna exhaled slowly, the implications heavy in her chest. This wasn't coincidence. This was contact. And the wild, whatever was left of it in Patch, was calling. Eyes in the dark, sleepless nights. The days that followed were anything but normal. Every night the same pattern repeated itself. At some point between midnight and dawn, the adult bobcat would return, never aggressive, never trying to breach the enclosure, but always watching. Jenna started calling her Shadow. Shadow came and went with ghost-like silence, her silver-gray coat gliding through the brush, as if she were part of the land itself. But her intent was clear. She wasn't hunting. She wasn't curious. She was checking in. Patch responded every time. He would sit near the door when Shadow appeared, sometimes mewing softly, other times pacing back and forth with restless energy. He refused to eat on those nights, his golden eyes constantly flicking toward the darkness outside, listening for her soft chirps. Jenna tried to sleep, but her nights became an anxious loop of camera feeds, scribbled notes, and midnight trips to the backyard with a flashlight in hand. She was both awed and unnerved. This wasn't animal behavior she was familiar with. Bobcats were solitary, especially females. And they didn't maintain relationships once a cub was removed, especially not with a cub that wasn't theirs. And yet here Shadow was, night after night. Jenna emailed a few wildlife specialists, attached the footage. Most replied with polite skepticism. Maternal behavior this long after separation is unlikely. Are you sure it's the same adult bobcat? Could be a coincidence, scavenging for food. But Jenna knew better. Shadow never approached the house, the trash bins, or even the water trough she'd left out at the far end of the yard. She came only for Patch. On the fifth night, something changed. Shadow didn't just sit at the fence. She approached the gate and dropped something, a chunk of raw meat, still fresh. Then she backed up and sat again, watching. Patch crept forward, sniffed it, and then looked at Jenna through the screen. He didn't eat it, but he stayed beside it all night. Jenna stood inside, stunned. This wasn't instinct, this wasn't coincidence. This was care. And it was rewriting everything Jenna thought she knew about the wild. A truth that breaks the rules. Jenna knew she was out of her depth. The footage she'd collected over the past week was not only stunning, it was confusing the experts. A solitary, sterile adult bobcat showing maternal behavior toward a cub that wasn't biologically hers? It contradicted everything researchers believed about wild felines. So she reached out to Dr. Amelia Reyes, a wildlife behaviorist at the University of Arizona, who had published work on feline bonding in captivity. When Jenna explained the situation, Dr. Reyes was intrigued enough to drive 3 hours to Sedona the very next morning. Dr. Reyes was in her 40s, practical, calm, and observant. She brought tranquilizer equipment, GPS trackers, and a small team to assist in safe, non-invasive tagging. Within 48 hours, both Patch and Shadow were fitted with GPS collars. Blood samples were taken carefully and analyzed back at the university. The results came in quickly. Shadow was not Patch's biological mother. She wasn't even genetically related to him. In fact, her medical profile revealed something even more surprising. She was infertile, either born sterile or rendered unable to reproduce due to a past injury. She had never birthed cubs of her own. That should have ruled out any maternal instinct. And yet, the data didn't lie. She was returning to the property nightly. Her GPS route showed her circling Patch's enclosure, dropping food offerings, even sleeping a short distance from the gate on 2 occasions. Dr. Reyes was astonished. "This is unprecedented," she admitted to Jenna. "This kind of nurturing behavior from an unrelated, non-maternal female, especially in the wild, hasn't been formally documented in bobcats." "Then what do you call it?" Jenna asked. Dr. Reyes stared at the monitor, where Shadow's form moved like mist through the screen. "I don't know," she whispered. "But it's real." Word spread quickly. Within a week, several universities requested copies of the footage. Wildlife publications picked up the story. Jenna found herself fielding interviews and explaining the emotional complexity she'd witnessed, though even she couldn't fully explain it. One headline read, "Ghost Mother, the bobcat that chose a cub not her own." The internet had its own theories, some scientific, some spiritual. But Jenna had stopped trying to label it. All she knew was that something powerful had taken root between the two creatures. And soon, that bond would be tested in the most terrifying way possible. When the wild fought back, a disturbance in the dark. The night was unusually quiet. No wind rustling through the mesquites. No owls calling in the distance. Just an eerie, pressing silence that made Jenna's skin prickle beneath her flannel sleeves. She sat on the edge of her bed, the glow of her laptop casting shadows across the room. Patch had been calm that day, eating more, even batting a pine cone around his enclosure. Shadow hadn't appeared for 2 nights in a row, and Jenna assumed perhaps the bond had started to fade, nature reclaiming its rhythm. At 1:46 a.m., her phone buzzed. Motion detected. Rear camera 3. Jenna's eyes locked onto the screen. She tapped the live feed and felt her breath catch. 3 coyotes were slinking along the edge of the fence line, thin, hungry, and coordinated. Their golden eyes glinted in the infrared glow. They were silent, but their posture was unmistakable. Focused, predatory. Patch was awake. The feed from inside the shed showed him standing rigidly by the door, his body low, tail puffed. Jenna grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, but she stopped herself. If she startled them now, they might scatter, or worse, charge. She watched. The coyotes moved fast. One darted to the side of the enclosure, sniffing along the mesh wall. Another moved toward the back gate. Then something unexpected happened. Patch let out a sound Jenna had never heard from him before. A throaty growl, sharp and primal. He crouched low, his claws scraping against the wooden floor. Outside, the lead coyote lunged, but it never made it to the gate. Out of the brush, like a silver bullet fired from the trees, Shadow exploded into the scene. She hit the first coyote full force, snarling, claws out, fangs bared. The camera feed turned into chaos, fur, teeth, and blood flashing across the screen. Jenna gasped, unable to move. Shadow fought like a creature possessed, biting and clawing with ferocity Jenna didn't think possible. The coyotes were thrown into disarray. One yelped and retreated. Another circled and tried again. But Shadow turned on it, landing a deep bite to its shoulder. After a brutal minute, the remaining coyotes fled into the night. Shadow stood panting at the fence, blood matting her side, chest heaving. She didn't look toward the house. She looked at Patch, still trembling, still staring. And then she vanished into the brush. Jenna stood frozen, heart pounding. Nature had just rewritten its own rules. Again, a guardian's wound. The sun rose slowly over Sedona's red cliffs, casting golden light on a backyard forever changed. Jenna barely slept. She sat by the window for hours, replaying the footage again and again. It was clear. Shadow hadn't just defended her territory. She had risked her life for Patch. At dawn, Jenna stepped outside, moving silently toward the enclosure. Patch was inside, huddled in the corner, his eyes alert but calm. He hadn't made a sound since the attack. When Jenna unlocked the door and stepped in, he didn't retreat. He just pressed his small body against her leg for the first time. He was safe. But Shadow. Jenna followed the trail behind the shed. Broken branches, torn earth, smears of blood. A few tufts of gray fur clung to the fence. No sign of a body, no prints leading out. It was like Shadow had disappeared. She contacted Dr. Reyes immediately. The GPS tag. Within an hour, they tracked her last known coordinates, nearly half a mile away, near the base of a dry ravine. Jenna and the research team moved fast, worried they'd find a corpse. But Shadow was alive. She was lying in the shade of a mesquite tree, sides rising and falling rapidly. Her left foreleg was gashed and swollen. Puncture wounds along her ribs suggested at least 2 direct hits from the coyotes. But her eyes, tired, yes, still burned with alertness. The team sedated her carefully, cleaned and dressed her wounds. She'd live, barely. She shouldn't have made it through that, Dr. Reyes murmured, shaking her head. She fought for him, like a real mother would. It didn't make sense, but it was undeniable. Patch paced anxiously the night she didn't return. He called into the dark with short, panicked chirps, his tiny cries bouncing against the shed walls. Jenna stayed with him, whispering that she was okay, that Shadow would come back. But even she wasn't sure. For the first time, Jenna saw Patch not as a rescued animal, but as a grieving child. And when Shadow returned days later, limping, thin, but very much alive, Patch pressed his body against the mesh, letting out the softest trill Jenna had ever heard. Shadow didn't respond with a growl. She simply lay down on the other side of the fence and closed her eyes. But everyone who witnessed it knew it was love. When the wild comes home, absence and echoes. After the attack, things shifted. Shadow disappeared for good this time. Her GPS tracker stopped transmitting 3 days after her last visit. Whether she died from her wounds or slipped the collar in the wilderness, no one could say for sure. Jenna searched the area, but the desert kept its secrets. Patch changed, too. He grew quieter, more independent. He began refusing food Jenna brought him, catching insects in the enclosure or stalking shadows for hours. His limp vanished. His golden coat thickened. His muscles filled out. Each day, he looked less like the wounded cub Jenna had rescued, and more like the wild thing he was always meant to be. Jenna knew what she had to do. But knowing didn't make it easy. She delayed the decision, hoping for more signs from Shadow, hoping for some closure. But it never came. Dr. Reyes visited again and confirmed it. Patch was ready for release. His instincts were sharp, his strength fully recovered, and his response to humans had shifted. He no longer approached Jenna when she entered the shed. He simply watched, silent and distant. Still, On the last morning, as Jenna unlatched the gate and opened the door, Patch didn't bolt. He stepped out slowly, one paw at a time, pausing at the threshold like he wasn't sure what the world would be like without the barrier. Jenna knelt beside the gate, eyes locked with his. She didn't reach out. She didn't speak. Patch looked back at her only once. Then, in a single bound, he vanished into the brush, the tall grass swallowing him whole. Jenna sat there long after he'd gone, the open gate swinging gently in the wind. She didn't cry, not then. Instead, she walked back to the house and gathered all the photos, videos, and notes she'd compiled over the past 2 months. She backed them up to 3 separate hard drives and shipped one to Dr. Reyes. The other 2, she locked away. Patch was gone, Shadow was gone, and all that remained now was a silence so full it rang louder than any sound. Still in her heart, Jenna knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. A wild gift. It had been 3 months since Patch disappeared into the wild. Jenna's days returned to a kind of normal. Quiet mornings, editing photos, dusty hikes for magazine assignments, and the occasional email from wildlife researchers asking for updates. Most assumed the story had ended with Patch's release. Jenna tried to believe that too. But something inside her stayed open, like a door she couldn't quite shut. Then, one early morning in late October, she opened her front door and froze. There on the porch was a rabbit carcass, freshly killed, untouched. Not torn or eaten, just placed carefully like an offering. Jenna scanned the yard. Nothing. She stepped forward, crouched near the rabbit and saw them. Paw prints, large, familiar. Her heart pounded. She reviewed the camera footage as fast as her fingers could fly. At 3:08 a.m., the infrared caught a blur near the tree line. Then, stepping into full frame, a bobcat emerged. Larger than before, broader in the shoulders, its coat sleek and full. It was Patch. He moved like the desert belonged to him, confident, silent. He approached the porch, dropped the rabbit, looked toward the house, and paused. For 10 full seconds he stood there. Then he turned and disappeared into the dark. Jenna leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the screen, breath caught somewhere between joy and disbelief. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a return home. It was a gesture of gratitude, of connection, of something ancient and wordless. The next night he came again, this time leaving behind a broken quail feather, tucked beneath the same stone near her door. No scratching, no meowing, just a presence and a gift. Patch never came close enough to be touched. He never entered the yard or looked through the windows. He simply visited, left something behind, and vanished before dawn. And Jenna understood. This was how wild things say goodbye. Not in words, not in gestures we recognize, but in silence, in instinct, and in echoes we carry long after they're gone. And as the last leaves of autumn drifted across the porch, Jenna knew. Some bonds don't need leashes or cages. Some bonds roam free and still return. More than a rescue. Jenna stood on the edge of Oak Creek Canyon, camera slung over her shoulder, eyes fixed on the horizon where the red rocks met the sky. The wind stirred her black hair, and for the first time in months, she didn't reach for her lens. She simply stood there, remembering. It had been 6 months since Patch's final visit. No more rabbits, no feathers, no paw prints in the dust. But that was okay. Jenna had learned that some stories didn't end with a door closing or a final wave. Some stories just drifted into the wild, unfinished, alive. She thought back to that trembling cub under the cactus, the bloody leg, the blink of uncertain trust. Then to Shadow, who'd come from nowhere with no obligation, just instinct, or maybe something even deeper. That animal had rewritten everything Jenna thought she knew about wild creatures, about connection, about what love looked like when it had no name. Dr. Reyes had gone on to publish a groundbreaking paper, Unrelated Maternal Behavior in Lynx rufus, a case of adaptive bonding or anomaly. It stirred conversation across the wildlife conservation community. Documentary teams came and went. A film was produced. Jenna's footage and her narration formed the emotional spine of the piece. The title was simple, Patch and the Ghost Mother. It won 2 awards. But fame had never been the point. Jenna declined interviews after the release. She returned to her quiet life, her trails, her camera, and her writing. The book she later published, Patch, the Cub That Came Home Wild, surprised even her. It wasn't just a wildlife memoir. It was about trust, about letting go, about the way some of us are meant to carry love, not keep it. In the final chapter, she wrote, I didn't rescue Patch. Not really. I just gave him space to become who he already was. And maybe, in some quiet way, he gave me the same gift. People still ask her, now and then, if she thinks Patch will ever come back. Jenna always smiles and shakes her head. He doesn't need to, she says, because love in the wild doesn't always look like return. Sometimes it looks like freedom. Sometimes like survival. And sometimes like a set of paw prints leading away from your door toward a life that was never meant to be tamed. One night in early spring, long after the documentary buzz had faded and life had settled into its normal rhythm, Jenna stood on her porch and listened. Far off, almost imperceptible, a chirp echoed in the canyon. Software, short, distinct. She smiled but didn't chase it. Somewhere out there, among the shadows and the cliffs, a creature who had once known her still walked the land. Wild, whole, home. And that was more than enough. In a world that often demands explanation, the story of Patch and Shadow reminds us that not everything needs to be understood to be meaningful. Sometimes, the most powerful connections happen in silence, without logic, without words, but with pure instinct and unspoken care. In life, we often look for love that mirrors us, familiar, predictable, but real love, the kind that changes us, can come from the most unexpected places. A stranger, a quiet gesture, or even from a wild creature that shouldn't have cared but did. This story isn't just about a bobcat. It's about recognizing when to nurture, when to let go, and when to trust that the ones we care about will find their way, even if that way leads far from us. If this story moved you, we invite you to stay connected with Paw Prints and Stories. Here, we explore the quiet miracles between humans and animals, stories that heal, humble, and inspire. Now ask yourself, when was the last time you did something kind without expecting to be understood?